all students grades 6 through 12. For complete details, go online to studentcam.org.
Historian and Middle East analyst Rashid Khalidi on Thursday spoke at a forum on U.S. efforts in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. From the Palestine Center in Washington, this is a little longer than an hour.
Into the overflow room. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Jerusalem Fund, I'm pleased to welcome you all back to the Palestine Center for this event today. I'd like to ask you all at this point to silence your cell phones if you haven't done so we could give our attention to our speaker today. Also, for our live online audience out there, please send your questions or comments on the online chat roll or via Twitter by tagging #PalCenter or direct messaging @PalestineCenter. Today's event is the annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture, and it is entitled The Palestine Question and the American Public Sphere. It's safe to say that no one had done more to shed light on the Palestine question in the Western world than the late Professor Edward Said. He did this with remarkable intellect, a posh and polished command of the English language that rivaled any American-born Israeli ambassador or representative, and an unwavering lifetime commitment to the principles of justice and humanism. His passing left a tremendous void in the lives of his family, friends, and all those he knew. It's great to have great Said with us today. But it also left a void in the effort for effective Palestinian advocacy in the United States. I'm honored to introduce our Edward Said Memorial Lecturer today, a Palestinian-American academic whose tireless work has contributed to filling the void Professor Said left behind. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. He received his BA from Yale in 1970 and his PhD from Oxford in '74. He's the editor of the Journal for Palestine Studies and was past president of the Middle East Studies Association and advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli negotiations from October 1991 until June of 1993. He's the author of numerous books and scholarly articles on Palestine and the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming our guest today, Professor Rashid Khalidi.
Well, thank you all for coming today, and to those of you who are watching, thank you for viewing this talk. Those of you who live in Washington and who are subjected to the American media will probably be relieved to hear that I will not be talking about the peace process. If you insist, I'm happy to answer questions about it. I'm going to talk about a broader topic, which I think sheds light on why there is not a process that is leading towards peace. And this is the Palestine question and the American public sphere. It's a great honor to be doing this in the context of the Edward Said Lecture Series. Edward was a dear friend. I'm glad Grace is here. I think that having a lecture series in his name will help to push the processes that he actually personally played, as Yusuf's introduction suggested, a very big role in opening up in this country. A number of factors played a part in cementing the support for Zionism and later for the State of Israel of its two primary international sponsors, Great Britain and the United States. As you know, each of them in its own era was the greatest power of its time. In winning over the British and the American political classes and their respective publics to the cause of Zionism and to the cause of Israel, a crucial role was played by scholarly and non-academic writings and later by the cinema and other media. I think it's insufficiently recognized that establishing the hegemony of Zionism in the field of ideas and in Anglo-American academic and public discourse was a vital precondition for its success in the political and diplomatic arenas. The discursive victories of Zionism preceded its triumphs in the chancelleries of the world and on the battlefields, and the latter would never have occurred, in my opinion, but for the former. In other words, in addition to being successful as an idea, as a national movement, and as a colonial settler phenomenon, political Zionism has always been a resounding public relations triumph. Now, the Zionist narrative was already almost uncontested in the United States even before 1948. My father and my mother, both of whom lived in New York in those years, tell me stories about how difficult it was to get out an alternative narrative. That Zionist narrative has become even more firmly entrenched in the public sphere in the decades since then, through extensive writings and through making major inroads into popular culture. The reason for this is not hard to understand. Historically, Zionist leaders, and after them leaders of the State of Israel, with good strategic sense and with a keen eye to opportunity and with a good story to tell, understood where to focus their efforts to garner international support, and the United States was a focus of this from a very early period. This was absolutely vital, they understood, to their efforts to create a Jewish state in what was then an Arab country. Overwhelming Arab majority, Arabs owned 94% of the land. It was an Arab country with a large Jewish minority. Not only to create a Jewish state in an Arab country, but also to create an impregnable position for it in a hostile region. Indeed, as they knew, it would have been impossible for them to have succeeded in their endeavor without massive external assistance, and therefore this work in the United States and in Britain and elsewhere was essential. What I'm going to discuss today mainly is how this Zionist and later Israeli narrative attained its preeminent status in this country. And then I'll conclude with a relatively brief assessment, unfortunately cursory because we only have about a half an hour or 35 minutes for the talk, of whether the power of this narrative may or may not be waning. For while for the better part of a century, this narrative was just as triumphant in the Western public sphere as were its Zionist and Israeli protagonists on the ground in Palestine. It has recently faced some challenges to its predominance, and I'll conclude by touching on some of those. I think it's worth noting that in some quarters, to even suggest that this narrative is preeminent or hegemonic is considered offensive, almost borderline anti-Semitic, while at the same time, any attempt to challenge its premises provokes fierce, sometimes vicious reactions. So you can't say that it's dominant, but if you challenge its dominance, heaven help you. So I think does any suggestion that this, and this is in fact a more important issue, so also does any suggestion that the Zionist movement in Israel were not or are not always and invariably underdogs and or victims. Challenging that premise is a very difficult thing to do. Zionist and Israeli history is rarely told by its proponents as the litany of almost unbroken successes and triumphs that is the real history of the modern Jewish national presence in Palestine. Instead, it's treated, usually treated anyway, as an appendage to the wrenching narrative of Jewish victimhood over 2 millennia of European history, culminating in the tragedy of the Holocaust. Now, in the decades down to the '67 war, and in fact well after the '67 war, the tenor of most of what was written and said in the American public sphere about Palestine and about this conflict was almost entirely driven by Israeli concerns and attitudes. The views of critics of Israel received limited circulation, if they got any circulation at all, while Palestinian and Arab views, as far as I can tell, made no impact whatsoever in this country for decades. Much attention was lavished on the supposedly miraculous nature of the establishment of Israel in the wake of the Holocaust, in the face of Arab opposition, and in the face of what was described as the indifference or hostility of much of the rest of the world to its creation. Now, if you know anything about Israeli historiography, you'll know that this narrow focus mirrored exactly the Israeli narrative of a heroic anti-colonial struggle for self-determination against terrible odds and against, in particular, the callous and anti-Semitic British. Only recently, with the publication in this country of Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete, was it possible to find a comprehensive work by a trade publisher that you could actually find in a bookstore that shattered this myth and showed how the successes of Zionism depended entirely on British support for at least a couple of decades. In virtually all writings and media coverage before 1967, the Arabs were portrayed extremely negatively, with dark hints that they were driven by deep anti-Semitism and indeed were Nazi sympathizers, if not worse. There is a rich trove of literature in this vein that is being produced to this very day. You can go online, or you can go on Amazon, or you can go to your local bookshop and find a bunch of fairly recent works which recycle these ideas. The Palestinians, if they were mentioned at all, and the word Palestinian was a dirty word. You couldn't use it for several decades in polite company. The Palestinians, if they were mentioned at all, were described as murderous and irrational enemies of the Jews and as having left their homeland in 1948 at the behest of their leaders, the better to enable the superior Arab invading armies to wipe out the fledgling Jewish state. These myths were central to the Zionist narrative, and they were hammered home relentlessly via every possible medium. This was done so effectively that these core Zionist myths came to be nearly universally believed in this country. By contrast, the general picture of Israelis in the American public sphere was highly positive. Glossy coffee table books and more serious books carried photos of handsome young men and buxom young women in shorts, busy making the desert bloom. There were no ugly people in Israel for the first 2 decades, if you believe the films and the books that you saw. Much was made. There were no dark people in Israel either. They were all very light complexioned. Much was made of the achievements of the new Israeli state in integrating immigrants, in building a strong economy, and in fashioning democratic state institutions. By contrast, little attention was paid to the continued sustained support that Israel received from the great powers throughout its existence, or to the colonial nature of Zionism as it related to the Arab majority of Palestine before 1948. Even less attention was paid after 48 to what happened to the Palestinians who had been forced to flee in that year, or to those who were left behind in Israel as Arabs, as citizens of the Israeli state, living under military rule, under a comprehensive system of surveillance and control until 1966. The iconic work of the first decades after 1948 was not a scholarly one. It was rather a thoroughly mediocre but incredibly influential novel by a man named Leon Uris, entitled Exodus, a Novel of Israel, whose sales equaled those of the highest-selling novel in American history up to that point, Gone with the Wind. Together with the Academy Award-winning 1960 motion picture of the same name with the handsome young Paul Newman as Ari Ben Canaan, this book probably did more to disseminate these and other fanciful and ahistorical myths than did all English language publications up to that point combined, and I would argue all English language publications perhaps up to this point. Now, I think it's worth noting that this book was not the unaided fruit of the loins, as it were, the intellectual loins, as it were, of Leon Uris. He wrote it, of course. But the book was commissioned by a renowned public relations professional, a man who is in fact considered by some to be the founder of public relations in the United States, a fellow by the name of Edward Gottlieb, who desired to improve Israel's image, and who chose Uris to write the novel after his successful first novel on World War II, and secured the funding which paid for Uris's research and trip to Israel. Given that many of the basic ideas about Palestine and Israel, held by generations of Americans, find their origin either in this trite novel or the equally cliched movie, Gottlieb's inspiration to send Leon Uris to Israel may have constituted one of the greatest advertising triumphs of the 20th century. The man deserves his place in the public relations pantheon. Needless to say, on every crucial point, the account purveyed in the mainstream media, in Exodus, and in academic literature was totally at odds with the historical record, as a very few lonely Palestinian and Western scholars pointed out in articles that were ignored in this country and elsewhere in the late 50s and the early 1960s. Among the main points in dispute was Israel's responsibility for the expulsion of about 750,000 Palestinians, the majority of the country's Arab population, from most of Palestine, the parts that became the State of Israel, and the true nature of the 1948 war. A huge edifice of scholarship, pseudo-scholarship, and rank propaganda was devoted to obscuring the realities of the dispossession of the Palestinians and to showing that the Arabs, supposedly much stronger than the Jews in Palestine, had both the intention and the capability to strangle the infant Israeli state at